Yes Music Podcast, episode 76, an interview with Yes live keyboard player Tom Brislin.
This is Tom Brislin over at tombrislin.com, and you are listening to the Yes Music Podcast.
Welcome to episode 76 of the Yes Music Podcast, one fan's exploration of the world's greatest progressive rock band. I'm your host, Kevin Mulrine. Please remember how you can get involved with the podcast via the various different ways on the site, yesmusicpodcast.com. Before anything else, it's my sad duty this week to mention the passing of the first member of the Yes family, Peter Banks. Peter died at the tragically young age of 65. Chris Squire mentioned Peter simply and appropriately in the middle of the concert in Aspen, and Yes World's press release read, "We are deeply saddened to learn about the passing of fellow bandmate and founding Yes member Peter Banks. He was a huge piece of the fabric that made Yes what it is, and our thoughts, sincere condolences and prayers are with him and his family. Peter, we shall miss you greatly. The originator of the name of the band and the co-creator of the musical identity of the early outfit will indeed be sorely missed. Ignoring all the usual ridiculous insulting behaviour which blights the otherwise essential resource yesfans.com, I learned that Peter left no provision for the obligatory arrangements. His former manager and friend George Miser is trying to help, but needs funds. If you feel you can help, you can log into your own PayPal account and use the address themiz, that's THEMIZ, all one word, at peterbanks.net. Some on yesfans.com were wondering if this is a scam, but others who actually know George are definite that it is not, and Rick Wakeman has also tweeted in support of those fans who are helping out. You can make your own mind up, of course. It's upsetting to think of the years of anguish Peter suffered due to the manner of his departure from Yes, and the way in which he believed he was badly treated in legal terms, and I think it's important to concentrate on celebrating his contribution to both Yes and progressive rock. Here's how I summed up his achievements on the first two Yes albums in the Yes Alphabet for B, episode 49. Peter Banks survived only 2 albums, Yes and Time and a Word, before being replaced by Steve Howe. You can read all about the way in which Banks left the band elsewhere, of course, but what I have learned through my exploration of the early music of Yes is that he was a crucial ingredient in that earliest period. As I've mentioned several times, it was Banks who pushed the live performances close to the edge. He led those concerts with such energy, power and passion that it must have made the audience sit up and listen. It must have marked out the band from the competition in the frenetic world of marquee gigs and festivals. For me, Banks will always be a critical element of the band's character. He was there at the start and helped to define the aesthetic, the approach and the spirit of Yes. Without his musical stature, creativity and unstoppable impetus to make great music, I'm sure I wouldn't be podcasting about the band today. Could Banks have retained the lead guitar role through the Yes album, onto Close to the Edge, Tales, Going for the One and all the rest? No, I don't think so. But I also don't think that the band could have survived to develop into the most important progressive rock act in the world without the start that Banks provided. Billy Sherwood was quoted on the BBC website. "I loved working with Peter on the many records I've produced over the years," he said. "He always delivered amazing stuff, creative, inspired, and always with that classic original Yes flavour that came with his playing. He will be missed by me and many, many other fans of his music and playing." And let's leave the final words to John Anderson. "I was watching the BBC footage just last month," he says, "and we spoke about those wonderful times. Peter was a unique guitar player and a kind soul. I will miss him. I feel very lucky to have spoken with him over the past year. Even though he was very sick, he would chat away about music and laugh about the journey we've all been on. He will be missed."
This is John Davison, and you're listening to Yes Music Podcast.
So the main part of this week's episode is an interview with the Yes live keyboard legend and now solo artist Tom Brislin, and here it is. Okay, I'm really excited to be able to speak to Tom Brislin, the keyboard wizard who played with Yes on the Magnification, or sometimes called the Symphonic Tour, in 2001. And I'm really looking forward to finding out about what that was like, but also about Tom himself, and also about his own music. He's a fantastic singer-songwriter in his own right. So thanks very much indeed, Tom, for coming along.
Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate it.
Okay, so just to get us going, tell us a bit about your early life. What were your first musical experiences like, and what kind of music was around in your family while you were growing up?
Everyone in my family played and or loved music, and the piano was basically the center of the home. And it wasn't long before I discovered my sister's record collections as well. That was my first introduction to rock music, and it was 70s fare, Foreigner, Yes, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, etc. When I discovered the radio, I was really into it. I would spend hours flipping the dial around and That was during the 80s pop and new wave explosion, groups like Men at Work, The Police, Tears for Fears, Prince, etc. So that was the sort of music collision that happened for me, and it was just a big part of the household.
Great. So what about specific musical training? You say that the piano was the instrument. Did you learn any other instruments, or? Eventually,
yes, but piano was the initial thing that I gravitated to. It was a surefire way to get attention in the house, start banging on the piano. And two of my sisters taught me starting at around age 6, and I kept with it and went with a local teacher named Anita DeSorbo all throughout high school, and then studied jazz and classical piano at university. As a teenager, I picked up some drums and percussion, and I started singing around the same time when I joined my first bands, initially as a backing vocalist, but it was just something that was always needed, so I started singing more and more often.
Yes, and I'm going to ask you a question a bit later about your singing with Yes, because I think that's one of the things that you're not really generally credited with, is the fact that you did sing during those concerts as well, though it's not mentioned on the sleeve notes anywhere. So how far did you go with, you said jazz and classical? Did you do lots of exams and qualifications in those, or was it at a lesser level than that?
It was actually very intensive in school. I was in a program that balanced music business studies with an instrumental track, and one would choose either the classical track or the jazz track. But because I seemed to have unlimited bandwidth at the time, I don't know how I did it, but I just was so hungry for music that I was doing both. On that instrumental side, I was playing jazz, and I had done the classical thing starting as a teenager, but I wasn't groomed for it like some kids are, where they're learning Mozart from the time they're 5. I just loved the music and definitely had a bit more of a rambunctious angle on it. But I got really into jazz and classical music as a teenager, and in college I was really into it and would play gigs with jazz groups, and also started various rock bands and would just jump into any band I could find that interested me all throughout the university days.
Right. Okay, well, you've already mentioned some of that amazing musical melting pot that you were influenced by, but who would you say were your biggest influences in those early days?
The aforementioned artists definitely got me daydreaming about playing music and playing in a band specifically. As far as real-world influences go, I think seeing my older brother, playing in various rock bands in New Jersey, that was a big influence because it was real to me, and I saw he played guitar, he played keyboards, and it was like my first introduction to synthesizers and just the gear and the mystique and just the rock world. I think that was probably what sealed the deal for me, is in terms of playing music in a band, which I had been attempting since I was about 10.
Right, yes, that's interesting. And what about Yes Music? What was the first Yes Music you heard, and what did you think of it at the time?
Supposedly I heard it in the womb, and I know I'm going to annoy people when I say that, but it's true. But I do remember hearing my sister's copy of Fragile when I was maybe 6 or 7, and always liked it.
Brilliant. Well, obviously the rest is history, as they say. You managed to land what to us Yes fans would be the best keyboard job in the world. Tell us exactly how that came about.
I was touring as a part of Meat Loaf's band, who at the time had the same management as Yes. They learned that I was practically raised on Yes Music and were keeping me in mind initially as a sub for Igor Korshev, who was with them at the time. Their whole situation changed. Igor was out, and Rick Wakeman was on a tour of his own at the time. The symphonic tour concept appeared to me to be originally hatched as a way to have the orchestra take the place of the keyboard player in the music. They contacted me with the initial idea of playing as part of the orchestra on piano and organ. But once John Anderson and I finished our first conversation about it, he wanted me to play everything that a Yes keyboardist plays, and yes, sing backup vocals at the same time.
Right. Well, that is very interesting because when I heard, being a Yes fan and very much into the music, when I heard that the orchestra was going to be used, I did it did puzzle me slightly that even when I was travelling to the concert in those days, there wasn't such a good online presence with all this thing. So I didn't really know what I was going to see in terms of the orchestra, and I was puzzling in my mind how some of those lines could be done on orchestra with just an orchestra rather than a keyboard player. So it was fascinating to see you up on the stage there in Birmingham when I got there. But what did it feel like for you to be stepping into the shoes of presumably some of your heroes, Rick Wakeman, Tony Kaye, Patrick Moraz, Jeff Downes? What on earth was that like?
Well, let's not forget Trevor Rabin. I'm sure he's got some nice shoes.
Absolutely.
But yeah, that was many big shoes to fill, and it was a unique experience because, yeah, those guys you mentioned, they were the murderer's row of just heroes of mine, and I thought each of them brought something unique to the table. And the way I approached it was just to take what I loved about each of their playing and each of their contributions and try to bring that forth in the music, as long as it made the bosses happy, and I had 4 bosses, so that was interesting.
Absolutely. Well, I think that really does come across, especially in the live DVD of the performance there. It doesn't surprise me at all to learn that you were a lifelong Yes fan, because that really, really comes through with the obvious enjoyment you're getting out of it. I'm interested, though, for the tour, what happened about the parts? I mean, obviously you knew the music anyway, but were you given keyboard parts as sheet music, or did you actually learn it all from the records?
All learned from the records. There are no, official books in their world. I mean, their people have released transcriptions and sheet music and things like that, but nothing that's official in-house. It was more, here are the records, and this is what we need you to do. So everything was learned by ear.
Right. But not quite as difficult for you as for some others, because you knew it all before you started. So really, if you were learning from the records, then generally speaking, some of the keyboard arrangements were presumably down to you. Did the rest of the band or the arrangers say anything to you about whether you could do some improvised elements or add your own feel to it? How much freedom did you feel that you had?
As is often the case in situations like this, coming into an established entity, they want to hear what they're used to hearing initially. And if you build that trust, maybe they give you a little rope here and there. It's interesting in terms of solos, things like Close to the Edge or Roundabout. It's expected people are going to want to hear those licks that they've grown accustomed to. But I'd also listened to a lot of the live recordings from the various keyboardists over the years and seeing how they approached it. And you see there's quite a range. Someone like Patrick Moraz takes it in a whole new direction. And whereas I was sort of sticking to using the recording as a jumping off point and still wanted to be in the moment and be present and not just be a parrot and just regurgitating some material out there. I wanted to be alive in the moment and be present and give a live music experience while still, sort of walking that line.
Yeah, that really does come through, and I'm very glad that we've got such a high quality recording as the DVD and the CD version, but particularly the DVD, because we can see what you're actually doing there. One thing I was interested in, though, was your keyboard setup. Now, compared with the slightly excessive, some would say, Wakeman or Downes setup, yours was a fairly minimal keyboard setup compared with that. Now, was that your preference? Was it presumably your own setup? Or was it because of the orchestra? Was there a lot of those orchestral parts so that there wasn't as many keyboards or such a range of keyboards needed? There
was a need for the full palette of sounds. However, there was a physical consideration because the orchestra took so much space on stage. And initially they were thinking that I would be part of them. So a lot of it was practical concern with logistics and touring. And But if I had my way, I would be up there with the ego rig of doom and all of the classic keyboard. I mean, one of the first things I did when I got the gig was I went and bought a Mini Moog. And I was ready to rock with Leslie's and all sorts of vintage goodness. But it was funny, John Anderson wasn't so keen on that. He wanted things to be a little bit more, in his view, updated. And I guess they remember all the hassles that these vintage instruments brought, whereas we remember all of the magic. So I had to concede that, and I was given a certain footprint on stage that I had to work with, while at the same time having to provide the full gamut of sounds.
Well, it certainly paid off the way that you did it. I'm interested also in the difference that there might have been between playing the orchestral arrangements of the original songs and those especially written for magnification. Now, they didn't play very many magnification tracks in those concerts, but did it feel different playing a song which had been specifically written for orchestra and band as opposed to the original songs?
Not so much. I think since I was called upon ultimately to play the classic material the way it was played, in some ways that was easier because it was very clear, whereas the magnification parts were peppered in and very supplemental, and they were a little bit more sparse because they were built for the orchestra to take on that role. But in a song like In the Presence Of, you had Alan White playing the piano part that he himself recorded in the studio. And again, in the magnification pieces, I felt part of the orchestra and sort of the backbone in that.
Yeah, okay. Well, when I mentioned on Twitter yesterday that I was talking to you this evening, well, it's evening for me anyway, one person who replied was the prog artist from Australia, Ben Craven, who's a big friend of the Yes Music podcast. And he mentioned that he thought that you're the only person, apart from Trevor Rabin himself, who's ever managed to nail the Owner of a Lonely Heart solo, which of course you did on a keyboard. And I took another look at the DVD, and he's definitely right. It is absolutely magnificent. That must have been a lot of fun to do.
It was, and funny story, it wasn't originally part of the set list, Owner. We were really sticking between magnification and classic 70s material, and a lot of that was, I think, had to do with Steve Howe, and that he wasn't a part of that era, and he, of course, I'm sure would have rather played the music that he was involved with. And I think there's been a lot of conjecture over the years from fans about Steve's position on that, but I talked to him about it, and he was just very plainly told me that he just thought his style was a different style, and that he wouldn't be giving people that element. So I suggested that I play the solo, and then Steve seemed to be agreeable to that because he would have his own part to contribute later on in the tune in his Steve Howe style, where I could approach the Trevor Rabin ultra harmonized 80s mania that's going on in the solo, and so it seemed to be, I was just quick on my feet so or in terms of suggesting that, because it's a song that the promoters and the fans and people really wanted to play on this tour, especially since we were playing in new territories that the band had never toured before. And here's the group's most known song. And so it was important, I think, to include Owner of a Lonely Heart in that concert, and especially on the DVD.
Absolutely. Well, for me, it worked spectacularly well. And I can't pretend to know what you were doing with all those pitch wheels and things, but it just it just really worked well. So you're talking about some of the members there. You've talked about John Anderson and how you spoke with Steve Howe and so on. But just give us a feeling of the first time that you met the band, Anderson, Squire, Howe and White, and what was the first rehearsal like?
The first time I met them is when I was in L.A. recording on Meatloaf's album. And then when I was finished with that, I went to visit them. They were at the house recording Magnification at the time, And so they had, I think it was one of Trevor Horn's houses, but I'm not sure. But they had filled this nice house in Bel Air or something with mobile recording equipment. And it was just a nice environment for them to create this album. And I showed up, and I don't know, they probably thought I was the pizza guy or something, because I was some kid showing up in their house. Hey, it's me. And really, it was all about a hang. We didn't play at all. We just hung out. And I think they were trying to get a feel for who I was and if I was the type of person they'd want on the road with them for a year. Because it was clear from the get-go that this was going to be a one-year thing and that Rick was going to be coming back, or at least they were aiming to, once his tour was over. So this was, I think, they just wanted to see how it would flow on the road. And I guess I passed the test. I just was kind of hanging out. And not knowing them, but knowing their backgrounds and the things that they've said in interviews, and knowing Yes Music put them at ease. Because I wasn't just some jobbing keyboard player that was just looking for another gig. I had a passion for Yes Music.
Great. And what about that first rehearsal then, the first time you played with them?
First rehearsal was at Reno, Nevada, which was the beginning of the North American Symphonic Tour. We were set up on that stage for a few weeks prior to the first show, as often happens with a lot of these arena tours. And so, because they're working out the lighting rig and the sound concerns and the staging. And it was a little different because we played Close to the Edge and we played it once. And that's it. Moving on. You got one shot because they know it.
Yeah.
And it's not really conducive to go back and do things over and over again when you've got such a massive work. I mean, we would chunk it into pieces and work out some things, but I was a little nervous because it wasn't just guys in a room playing. It was all of the staging and all this other potential distraction coming in, and I'm sitting here trying to play Close to the Edge with Yes for the first time, no pressure.
No, that sounds really, really quite nerve-wracking. And what about night after night then on the tour? What were those folks like to work with night after night?
They were so consistent performing-wise. I mean, especially, well, all of them really, but especially John Anderson, I think deserves a special mention because being a singer on the road is very tough. The voice is the most vulnerable instrument, I think, in terms of wear and tear and night in and night out. And it's easy to strain your voice, even going day to day with all the talking that you have to do to people, and it can wear you down. And he was just amazing every show. I was just in awe, and he had taken good care of his voice. He was careful not to talk when it wasn't necessary. He was in tour mode, and drinking his tea and taking it easy. And I mean, there were some nights on that tour where he was pretty sick, and showtime came and he turned into the John Anderson that we all see in concert. It's pretty remarkable.
And the rest of the guys?
Definitely. I mean, they know the music like the back of their hand, so they just get up there and it's Yes mode. I think Steve Howe is the type of guy where it seemed to me that given the choice to do anything, he'd play his guitar. And he just give him a guitar, and he would be there early sound checking by himself in the afternoon, just playing tunes. And sometimes once I got hip to that, I would start sneaking up there on stage and start throwing songs at him that he played on that weren't in the set. Yes tunes, Asia, GTR, just to give him a kick out of it. And he loved it. He'd look at me and be like, all right, let's play that song. And Alan and Chris are just, touring seems to be their element.
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting to me because not being one of those lucky people to have met any of the members of the band yet, although I'm fully intending to do so, that you get a fairly one-sided view from the fans themselves of what the men are like. I mean, for example, there's a common perception that Chris Squire is very domineering and quite controlling, but from what you've saying, that just didn't come across on the road?
I think that the goals are remarkably similar among the guys. It's about putting on an exceptional performance. And so Chris is interesting because he'd be on the other side of the stage than I was, but he had this amazing perception. If anything was a little funny or something on the stage, he would be hearing it amidst the chaos sometime. Mm. In fact, they had me go and proofread some of the orchestral transcriptions because they don't read music. Alan does to a degree, but they're saying, they said, Tom, go look at these scores. Something doesn't sound right in this part of this tune in terms of where the violins are going or something. And it's just because a lot of things are put together pretty rapidly, and there can be a error here or there. And so I think Chris he's just got this radar going and just wants to make the Yes ship run very tightly, I think. And he's got amazing ears. Like if we'd be out somewhere and there'd be music playing in the background, he would notice something about it and make a comment to me. He's like, "Oh, you hear how that bass line is changing there?" So he's always listening.
Absolutely. Well, there you go. So you played keyboards, all those amazing keyboard parts. You sang. You looked at the parts for the orchestra. So really, you must have felt pretty integral to what was going on.
I tried to do my best and give it all I had, really.
So looking back now, how do you rate the experience of playing with Yes for that year compared with some of the other high-profile bands you've worked with? Meatloaf, Debbie Harry, Renaissance, Camel, Francis Dunnery, the list seems to go on.
Each of those tours or recording projects that you mentioned brought something to my attention as a musician and forced me to improve and become better as a player and just to grow, and they were pretty magical, and I love just the fact that you get to perform with a group that makes so many people happy. But I think where Yes is in a unique position for me personally was that this was music that I was really passionate about from childhood, in terms of I had their posters on my wall, and I listened to the bootlegs, and friends of mine and I would have inside jokes about this music, the interviews they gave, and so it was different. I think something from the other groups you mentioned, it was always a part of the fabric of my musical background. But I think Yes has this sort of unique memory for me in that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much indeed for those fascinating insights. But of course, you are also a successful solo artist in your own right. So let's hear about your new album now.
Yes, I have released my very first solo album. It's called Hurry Up and Smell the Roses. And this is an album that I recorded here in Nashville, Tennessee, for the most part, where I moved here from New Jersey and filled a room with keyboards and microphones and started writing and recording and playing most everything on it. And so it was definitely a very personal effort. I was in a group called Spiraling for a few years, where I also was a songwriter, and that was an electro rock type of environment, whereas this album and the current format in which I perform in, it's piano and vocal. The album has all percussion and all sorts of other flavors added to it, but the piano and the lyrics and the vocal are sort of the heart and soul of this album. I
recognise that very much. I've really enjoyed listening to the album, and I do think you have a special talent for melody and hooks. And is this the kind of music you feel most at home with yourself, composing and playing? Because it's not really similar to any of the bands that we mentioned above, is it?
I think there are some similarities in terms of valuing melody and not worrying too much about rules. I think that's one of my favorite Rick Wakeman quotes. And he was talking about rock and roll. And he said, to him, rock and roll meant no rules. So progressive rock is just another type of music that they didn't impose rules on themselves. Initially, it was more about, hey, let's throw this in there. That sounds cool. Or this would be unexpected if we went this direction. And I think my own music, I try to just write first and ask questions later. Stylistically, it might not be in the same category on iTunes, but I don't know. It's funny because the progressive rock community has embraced this album, and they've embraced me, mainly because of my involvement with these groups like Yes and Camel, Francis Dunnery Renaissance, and but I've never gone out there saying this is progressive rock or this is in the style of Yes. I've just said, here's my music, and I call it cinematic pop because I think at the core of it, it's pop music, and that's definitely a part of me and where I come from. But I think the eclectic nature is a common thread.
Absolutely. Now, are you playing live a lot to support the album?
It's coming. The tour dates are starting to materialize now. One of the things about the DIY movement in music and it's easy to fall in this trap of do everything yourself, which isn't a good idea. Whereas, so making this album was pretty time consuming in that I was the judge, jury, and executioner of it all, and I was the producer and recording engineer, and now I'm the record label. And so next thing you know, you're like, okay, this album's out and I need to tour. So I'm focusing more on that now, and it looks like I'm playing in a couple places in the U.S. in this month and beyond. But I think I'm going to be spending a good deal of the rest of the year out there playing live, and I'm pretty mobile and flexible because it's just me, piano and vocal.
So those are the short to medium-term plans for the future. Have you looked any further ahead than that to another album or any more live work?
Well, I know I'm always going to be doing something. I haven't thought about another album yet just because Hurry Up was such an undertaking. And another thing that's been taking up some of my energy in a good way is I had launched this album through Kickstarter, which is one of these crowdfunding sites where you put the project out there and say, I want to make this album, and would you like to pledge to make it possible? And in return, you offer fantastic prizes. And one of them, I boldly stated that I would record any song that by anyone, any cover song, my own version, if someone had pledged a certain amount. And it was a very popular reward that I was offering. And so here I am. I'm just about to finish recording 34 cover songs.
Good grief.
Yeah. Now they're pretty. I know they're pretty stripped down. Again, it's me playing them on the piano. Some of them are instrumentals. Some of them I do little vocals or percussion. But I set myself up for that pretty good because I know that I'm a quick study and I can get things together quickly. But I want to put out quality stuff, and so while this tour is starting to come to fruition, I am going to be putting out basically a cover song out there every week. Nice. For people to hear. So it's fun. It's actually, again, it's always a good experience to learn something new. And I've had some cover selections of things I'd never even heard of before. So it's a good education.
It certainly sounds like it. Well, where can listeners find you and your music, including the covers?
My official site is tombrislin.com. That's all one word, and it's all I's for my last name. And you can hear my entire album there. I have it all streaming, so people can listen to what I'm up to in its entirety. The cover songs will be going up there as well. And then all the live dates and other good things that are coming in the future will all be posted there.
Well, that's great. And I know you can also embed your album, which I've done in the show notes to previous episodes of the podcast, so I'll be doing that again this time to give people even quicker access to your music, perhaps. But I do recommend the new album to all listeners. It's a fantastic piece of work. I've really, really enjoyed listening to it. And Tom, this has been absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for your time. It'll make a brilliant episode of the podcast.
Great, Kevin. Thanks for having me on here, and hello to everyone out there in Yes Land.
So that's about it for this week. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with a very exciting multimedia episode, but in the meantime, please do get involved by subscribing to the podcast via RSS, iTunes, Stitcher.com, on your BlackBerry or via the Apple Podcasts app. at yesmusicpodcast.com, where you can leave a comment on the blog. You can send a tweet or direct message to at yesmusicpodcast on Twitter. You can send an email to show@yesmusicpodcast.com. You can upload an audio file or record a voice message via the buttons on the site, or leave a voicemail on 0844 579 6949 using the mailbox number 39417. So until next week, just remember, whatever your progressive rock question, the answer is yes. Yes Music Podcast, episode 75, an interview with Yes Book author Scott O'Reilly.
This is Tom Brislin over at tombrislin.com, and you're listening to the Yes Music Podcast.